All right, well, thank you, everyone. Hello, greetings. Welcome to both people in the room here and on Zoom. And thank you for braving a breezy Saturday to attend Gardening for Biodiversity with Native Plants, presented by Master Gardener Heidi Dollard. A few words about Heidi. Along with being a Master Gardener, Heidi is co-chair of the steering committee of the Mass Pollinator Network. Heidi has a Master of Science degree in biology, and she is a sought-after expert on native plants and the vital role they play in supporting healthy ecosystems and how we can incorporate native plants in our gardens. For those people who are on Zoom, please feel free to type your questions into the chat, and we'll get to as many of them as possible during the question and answer session at the end. And I'm just going to keep this short, so without further ado, the Carlisle Environmental Sustainability Committee is very pleased to introduce Heidi Dollard.
Thank you. Thank you so much for hosting me. And also, I want to congratulate the town of Carlisle on their excellent pollinator resolution, one of the best I have seen in Massachusetts. So let me get started. A lot of information to cover. Oops.
Page up, page down?
It's working. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of background. This crowd may not need it, but let me just start with the basics. We really, really need insects. Insects, according to E.O. Wilson, he was an entomology professor at Harvard, really understood the ecology of insects. And he called them the little things that run the world. They are so important to every aspect of our lives. He even estimated that if all insects were to be eliminated somehow, humans would have about 6 months before they would all be eliminated too. They pollinate a third of our food crops. They pollinate 80% of the flowers on Earth. They're the bottom of the food chain. They're how calories get from green plants, which are making food from the sun, up to bigger and more complicated animals. They provide many, many other ecological services, such as seed dispersal. They help in decomposition. They aerate the soil. These are all things that we really can't take for granted. And they're really essential for life on Earth. So let me just do a quick little review of what pollination is. So, as you know, plants are stuck in the ground for most part. So if they want to have sexual reproduction where they mix up their genes, they need help. Something has to mechanically get the pollen, which is basically the male gamete, to the female, to what the equivalent in a plant is to the ovary. Something has to get it there. Some plants are wind pollinated, some plants are water pollinated, but most of them have an insect intermediary that carries it from one plant to another. And without that mixing of genes, when you mix up those genes, you get new traits, you get new capabilities. That's what keeps species and populations adaptable, being able to change with changing conditions. And that's what we have. We have a lot of changing conditions right now. So this is really, really essential for plants to have this capability. And for many of them, if their insect partner were to disappear, they would disappear too. They would have no way of creating seeds. They would have no way of making the next generation. Some plants can reproduce vegetatively. As you know, they spread by roots. But that does not create any genetic diversity whatsoever. So in the course of evolution, plants kind of made this evolutionary deal with insects that they would offer some nutrients, some pollen, some nectar in exchange for the plants providing this the insects providing this pollination service. It's not like, they made a verbal deal, but that's basically the ecological trade-off. So this is why pollinators, we're concerned with all insects. We want them all to be on Earth, even the ones that bother us and we hate them. We need them all. But pollinators are of particular concern. So we've seen huge decreases in insect populations in recent years. In the last 50 years, since I was a teenager, in many places, we've seen a 70% decrease in the biomass of insects. This is a terrifying statistic. And you can see in this graph, the Lepidoptera, or the moths and the butterflies, are going down, but all other invertebrates are even in worse shape. And here's a slide. I just created this slide this morning from 2 articles that were in the paper yesterday, that the butterflies, they're an important pollinator. They're just tanking. The populations are tanking. So why is this happening? There's 3 major problems at work here. One is pesticides, one is habitat loss, and the last one is no food. So I've illustrated that in these 3 slides. Does anyone know why this represents loss of food? Does anyone recognize this plant? Very common in many gardens around here.
It's very blurry.
What is it?
It's blurry, we can't see it.
Oh, sorry. It's blurry. It's Bradford pear. It's which, very common in garden centers. This has become a really noxious invasive plant that is taking over unused fields and woods all over the eastern seaboard. It's just, when I drive to North Carolina to visit my daughter in the spring, we drive past miles and miles and miles of old fields that are now just choked with Bradford pear. So let me talk more about pesticides. Neonicotinoids is probably the worst pesticide, and you may not have heard of this. It's one that's very commonly used both in the horticulture industry and also in agriculture. It's a whole class of pesticides, and it's relatively recent that it was invented, but they've been able to correlate the introduction of these neonic chemicals with the biggest declines of insects. So they really, the thing that we really need to do is to just outlaw them. But in the meantime, we have to be really careful not to buy any plants or any seeds that have been treated with neonics. And so if you're going to a nursery that is not promised to be all native or all organic, you really need to talk to them. And if they can't say, oh no, we're sure, you just walk away and they'll get the message. And a lot of nurseries are getting the message. Actually, I could go on and on about neonics, but I do want to say that one of the reasons why they're so pernicious is that the soil is treated and then they're taken up into the plant tissue. It's systemic and it persists. It persists in the soil, it persists in the plant tissue. It goes into the nectar and the pollen and the seeds, and it stays in the environment for years. So even one application will be killing insects way into the future. And one of the people that I've been working with lives at a retirement community in Northampton. And so she's been investigating to see what their landscape company puts in they have one of these beautiful, perfectly manicured landscapes. They are putting tons and tons of neonics into their landscape because they want it to look perfect. But they're turning it into basically a Superfund site. So aerial spraying is another huge problem. In Massachusetts, the state sprays for mosquitoes. As soon as one little mosquito with equine encephalitis pops up, they break out the sprayers and they go driving around and spray. And it's the law. It's really hard. You can ask to be exempted, that your property is exempted, but it's aerial. It's going to drift. It's going everywhere. They're spraying a town. So it's really important to not spray for mosquitoes, and in fact, to get the word out that it's terribly damaging. It kills everything. And it's not even effective. It is not even the best way to control mosquitoes. I can talk more about the best ways to kill mosquitoes, but I also want to talk about a lot of mosquito companies say, oh, it's organic, it's natural. Well, maybe it is, but that doesn't mean it isn't toxic. I mean, think of an amanita mushroom. What could be more natural and organic? But would you eat one? No, no. So organic does not mean safe. It just means that artificial chemicals were used. So there's a lot of greenwashing in both the landscape industry and the horticulture industry. So if you must kill insects, and sometimes you really have to, really figure out what the most targeted means of doing that is, and just use that one method. So for example, if you have a lot of mosquitoes, you can put out a bucket of water with something called the dunk in it. You can get it at Lowe's or Home Depot. And it's very specific. It won't just kill mosquitoes, it'll kill a few other related insects. But basically, it will kill the female mosquito will lay her eggs in that bucket, preferably of like kind of yucky water, put some dead grass in it. And then they'll be killed at the larval stage. And so that's very, very specific. Only the stuff in that bucket will be killed. But it will attract the female, and then it'll kill the larvae. Another thing that's really simple to do, if you want to sit outside and there's mosquitoes flying around, just put a fan out, very low volume oscillating fan. Mosquitoes can't fly against even a light breeze, and then you won't be killing anything. So those are just two examples. So let me talk about habitat loss. This is what a good deal of our landscape now looks like. It's grass and it's non-native trees and bushes. And so it's really an ecological desert. Much of our open land is becoming, housing. People do need to live in houses, but all of the space between the houses certainly could be made ecologically useful. Another huge problem are all these non-native ornamental plants. They're not really they're not part of the ecology. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. And another big problem is if you go out to a conservation area, probably a lot of people like to walk, and you'll notice that the species mix of the plants is drastically changing. It's becoming these non-native invasive plants, bittersweet. Now, so many of the trees in our conservation areas, they're just draped, they're covered. It's like a blanket of bittersweet, and that is killing the trees, and it's not feeding any of our native insects or our native wildlife. Yes, the birds eat the berries, but that's not a good thing, because then they're carrying those berries in their bodies until they poop, and they're spreading it everywhere. So these invasive plants are another reason why habitat is disappearing. Lawn is a huge problem. The USA has 40 million acres. Actually, I think that might be an old statistic. It is the largest irrigated crop in the United States. It is an area the size of the state of Georgia. That's lawn, which is like a desert. So converting lawn to habitat, that's the golden spot. And I think for a lot of people, the easiest and the thing that they can do. So this is a lovely suburban landscape. Probably, at least at one point, I would have been thrilled to have my front yard look like this. But now I realize that this is not doing the ecology any good. These are all non-native plants. They're not, probably this lovely lawn is supported by chemicals. And so this is not a helpful species mix in this yard. traditionally the horticulture industry just sold non-native plants. One of the reasons why, and you may have seen this like in a seed catalog or even on a plant tag, nothing eats it, not bothered by anything. Well, that means, yeah, it's not feeding anything. You actually want to see little holes. Maybe not a lot of holes, but at least you want to see that something is eating the plants in your yard, because then you're feeding the insects, which are feeding everything else. So, food and habitat, we can control that. If you have even a little patch of land, even if it's a planter, that is something you can control. And how amazing is it in this day and age to be able to actually make a difference with your own two hands? And nobody can tell you no. Maybe I'll talk a little about homeowner associations, but basically there's a lot you can do. So again, native pollinators need to eat native plants, not non-native ornamentals, and certainly not invasive plants. So this is the iconic monarch caterpillar on the iconic milkweed plant. And this is an example of a very tight association. The caterpillar has evolved just to eat plants in the milkweed genus. That's Asclepias. They can't eat anything else. That's all they can eat. There's in our area, there's probably 5 different species of milkweed that they can eat. No milkweed, no monarchs. That's the bottom line. And the reason that they evolved is that plants, they're not just sitting there waiting to be eaten. They're putting out all these chemicals that are actually toxic to the caterpillars. So the caterpillars then have to develop some sort of metabolic strategy for being able to digest those toxins. And it's really hard ecologically or evolutionarily to be able to digest everything. So they specialize. They say, okay, we've developed ways of dealing with these toxins, but we can't eat oak leaves. We can just eat this. And that's the way a lot of interactions between plants and insects are. A lot of caterpillars can only eat certain plants, and they're almost all native. So caterpillars are usually specialists. They eat a very narrow range of plants. So this is what we call a host plant. It provides both a place to live and food for early life stages. Butterflies, on the other hand, they just want to eat nectar. The adult butterflies just need nectar, is just sugar water, and they can pretty much eat anything as long as their mouth parts are adapted to fit into that shape of flower. So they're generally pretty flexible, not as flexible as a lot of caterpillars. Some bees are generalists, but many are very specific. They have mouth parts that are adapted just to specific flower shapes. And that's why a lot of bees are actually on the decline now too. So a note about honeybees. Honeybees are not native bees. They're from Europe. They were brought over with European colonists. They're livestock, like pigs and chickens. Yeah, they've had a lot of setbacks in recent years, but they're not going to go extinct. People are going to take care of them. They're very important for very, very large agricultural areas where there's not enough native bees to fertilize the crops. So if you want to help bees, you don't want to keep honeybees, because the honeybees actually compete with native bees and they snork up all the resources, and then the native bees don't have enough to eat. So don't think you're helping bees by keeping honeybees. If you want to keep honeybees for honey, that's one thing, but you're really not. You're helping the wrong bees if you're keeping honeybees. So I've been talking about what native plants here. Let's talk about the definition of a native plant. So it's pretty easy in North America because we know when Columbus came. So anything that was here before Columbus is a native plant. Before the colonists arrived and brought all their animals and their hay and garden plants and stuff, the experts do differ on the definition of what here means. The broad definition is any plant that is from basically the East Coast. A narrow definition is any plant that was like here, like right in our ecozone, right in our immediate area. The Massachusetts Pollinator Network takes a pretty broad view, but there's good reasons to take a very narrow view. So, if you do some research and figure out what your resources and your goals are, you may also want to take that narrow view. There's a lot to be said about planting plants that really have evolved in this particular area. So it's a big subject of debate, but you could go either way. So now I want to talk a little bit about nativars. So a nativar is a cultivar of a native plant. So that's where some human horticulturists said to, hey, this aster, it's okay, but it would be really better if the flowers were bigger, or it had snazzier colors, or it didn't have such a ratty look. We want something like more mound shaped. And so they go about breeding for those characteristics that would please humans, as opposed to characteristics that are good for the insects. So I actually want to encourage you to not treat nativars as native plants. And here are the reasons why. Where it is true, some of them are just as good or even better ecologically. It's really hard to know without doing a ton of research. And even then, it's hard to know. But the reasons are, so these are a whole bunch of cultivars of echinacea, purple coneflower. The wild type or native type looks like that kind of plain one up near the top of the picture. It's just has, plain old petals. But then, humans wanted different colors and they wanted it to be all poofy. And the problem with all this variation is that sometimes the insects either can't recognize that that's an echinacea, so they just pass it right by, or they know there's nectar and pollen somewhere in there, but they can't get to it because all these other flower parts, these extra petals, are blocking it. Or sometimes they're actually bred not to have pollen because it's messy when you have a cut flower. For example, a lot of sunflowers and a plant that I planted a lot in my yard before I know, an Annabelle hydrangea, it's bred not to have any pollen. That's not helpful to bees. That's terrible for bees. So unless you do a lot of research, you just won't know. Sometimes they bloom at the wrong time. Sometimes they're not even that species. They're a hybrid. Caterpillars may have a tough time with cultivars that have a different leaf color. A lot of shrubs now, they have like purple. They're bred to have purple flowers because, looks nicer in the garden. That's bad for caterpillars because either they may not recognize it, or those extra anthocyanins are actually toxic to them. So as I said, a few are as good or better, but it's really hard to know which. And even though they've done some studies, they've done some tests, and they've done, they've recorded, the bees there's a Phlox giana, which is supposed to be super great for bees. But a lot of times these cultivars come in and out of the market, and the people testing them can't keep up. So do not count them as a native plant. It is true that nativars, this got cut off. Nativars that just change the growth habit. So they're smaller, or they're more compact, or they're tall and skinny instead of sprawling. Those seem to be okay. That is what we think now. So how to identify nativar from a plant label? If you're out shopping, a lot of places will tell you, if you ask, say I'm looking for native plants, they will point you to the nativars because that's what they want you to buy. That's what they have in stock. So if you look at the plant label and it just has two names, like Echinacea purpurea, that's the genus, that's the species. That's the wild type. But if it's a cultivar, it's going to have an extra name in quotes, like Echinacea powwow white or Echinacea Cheyenne spirit. In this case, they just dropped the species name altogether. I don't know why they do that sometimes. Sometimes the cultivar will have a string of numbers as its identifier. So that's an important thing to know. So let's go back and talk about invasive species. This is unfortunately a fairly typical woodland edge where the trees are just completely carpeted by bittersweet. And these trees are doomed. Not only are they going to be pulled down in a big storm, but it's impossible for any of their seedlings to grow up underneath this deep shade. So this is just a disaster. Other invasive plants that you may have in your landscape, multiflora rose, bittersweet, Bradford pear, I mentioned those two. Burning bush is just endemic. People love burning bush. A lot of times when I mention this, they just say, oh, but I love my burning bush. Well, your burning bush is making little seeds that are going everywhere. There's an area near me in the woods that it looks like the woods look normal until the fall. And then the entire understory is pink because the entire understory is burning bush. And when it doesn't turn bright red in the shade, it turns pink. It's so obvious that, again, that woodland is doomed because nothing can grow up under that thick pink understory. Asian honeysuckle is another really pernicious one. Autumn olive, garlic mustard. That's just a low-growing vegetative annual. Norway maple. A lot of people have Norway maples. They can just seed themselves like crazy. And again, buckthorn. There's also knotweed. Does anyone have knotweed? Yeah. It can be. I used to think it was one of the worst. Now I think it's actually one of the easier ones if you just mow it and mow it and mow it. And never just like as often as possible. It may take a couple years, but can be done. So the 70% native guideline, Doug Tallamy, who you may have read, he's a very famous entomologist who's really doing a lot of work in educating people about how to handle their landscapes. And one of his graduate students, who's now, I believe she's at UMass Amherst, her doctoral thesis was asked the question of what a suburban landscape needs to look like to support birds' reproductive ability to reproduce. So they just looked at one species, Carolina chickadees. I don't think that's one. But so Desiree counted how many caterpillars were needed, and she also looked at the percentage of native plants. So this was suburban Washington, D.C. And she determined that if the plants in an area, like in a large yard, were 70% native by biomass, so if you could cut all the leaves off and weigh them, I don't know how she estimated that. Obviously, she didn't cut them all off and weigh them. But if they were 70%, then the Carolina chickadees could successfully raise a clutch of chicks. And if it fell below that, either the chickadees just gave up and didn't even bother laying eggs, or they laid eggs and the chicks died. And she counted the number of caterpillars that were needed to raise a clutch of 3 chicks, missing one somewhere. And it was 6,000 to 9,000. So these are really tiny birds. This bird weighs as much as 4 pennies, and it needs 9,000 caterpillars. So we need to be farming for caterpillars. That's what our yards need to be. If we want these songbirds, first of all, if we want them in our yard, if we want this species to persist, if we don't want them to go extinct. So which natives to plant? The first rule when you're planting anything, right plant, right place. Do not think about modifying the soil or modifying anything. Just choose plants that are going to be happy in your yard as it is now. I mean, yeah, you can do a little bit, but no extraordinary measures, not even any compost. Most native plants, they just like the native soil the way it is. So it's just a matter of matching the plant to your growing conditions. As I mentioned, trees and bushes, they provide a lot of biomass. So trees and bushes are really great. Also, they create a lot of complex spaces. So it actually, they provide a lot more ecological niches than plants that are just lower growing. So you want to aim for host plants, which are plants that provide both, that feed and house caterpillars and other early stages. And of course, you want plants that provide nectar and pollen. You want something blooming from early spring past frost, a variety of flower shapes and colors if you can, If you have a tiny lot, you can't do everything. You got to, do the best you can. There's so many plant lists available on the internet. The Northampton had a pollinator pathway project, and they hired Evan Abramson, who's a really outstanding ecological landscaper, and he developed a list. That just applies to Western Massachusetts, but I know that there's tons and tons for Eastern Massachusetts. And you can also, the National Wildlife Federation, they have a plant finder, and they also just came out with some additional plant lists that are really good for what I guess everybody is calling soft landing gardens. So I'll talk more about that. So here are some examples of some really, really valuable trees. These are the top 3 trees in terms of providing ecological value. The first is oaks. Whenever I say that, there's always someone who goes, "Oh, I hate the oaks," because they're really messy. I once was consulting at a retirement community, and I said, "Well, the best one is oaks," and one woman said, "No oaks. The acorns will kill us. They're a death trap." Well, yeah, you won't plant them next to the walkway or the driveway. You need the right plant. It's not only the right place for the plant, but it has to be the right place for the humans too. But there's a lot of very small oaks too, not just the giant forest trees. And then I've also heard people say, we got so many oaks around here. I don't need to plant oaks. Well, the sad fact of the matter is that a lot of our oaks are in trouble out there in the woods. They're not reproducing successfully, in part because of the invasive species, in part because of changing climate conditions. So actually, we do need to plant oaks so that there's oaks for future generations. But there are a lot of oaks that are really, really small and very suitable to smaller lots. Cherries, remember, these have to be all native species. If you go to a garden center and ask for cherry, they're going to probably point you to a Japanese cherry. It's not what you want. You want a native cherry. And there's a number of different species. This is a picture of the most common one. It's probably in your woods around here. I think you could only get it in a native plant nursery. I don't think you could get it at a traditional nursery. But it's a beautiful plant. It has beautiful flowers in the spring. A house that I lived in like 35 years ago had a little stand of these in the backyard. And when they bloomed, it was just magical. This just airy, pinkish white mass of flowers. And then there's willows. You probably know the pussy willow. And all this yellow stuff is pollen. And it is one of the first things to bloom. And the males only produce, it's one of those plants that has males and females. The male produces a huge amount of pollen, which is really, really useful for early flying bees. So what we see actually, oh, and I also want to say oaks are not pollinated by insects. They're wind pollinated, but turns out bees still eat the pollen. So there's still a good pollen source, even though they're not part of a pollination system. They don't have, they haven't made a deal with any insects, but still very useful. So these are the things that bloom early. And so if you're looking to provide early to late flowers, you really need to have shrubs, bushes or shrubs. And here's some others that are really, really useful and really beautiful. A lot of these are very familiar to you. Redbud, dogwood, I'm forgetting the name of that. Yes, thank you. This is serviceberry. The book was just written by this. This is gorgeous, beautiful plant, also called Juneberry. And this is hawthorn. All early bloomers, all just gorgeous in the landscape. Here's some really great shrubs. Blueberries, any kind of blueberry, huge ecological value. And if you can protect it from the birds, you can actually get some edible fruit out of it. Inkberry is really great. I think this is the inkberry. Elderberry, that's summer sweet clethra. This is, which one is this? Chokeberry. This is one of my favorites. It's so beautiful. It's lightly scented, and there's two species. One gets these really dark, almost black berries, and the other one gets these really bright, purpley red berries. And then this is flowering raspberry, which is really, really good in the shade. Just beautiful plants that, would really fit in many, many suburban landscapes. And then there's the weeds that pop up that, I have to confess, I pulled out great blue lobelia by the handful before I knew any better. But once it's happy, it self-seeds like crazy, and it's a great pollinator plant. This one, self-heal, prunella, is often in the lawn. In fact, it's a good addition to a flowering lawn if you want to make your lawn more bee-friendly. Pokeweed, another plant people seem to hate, but super, super useful to migrating birds because they eat the birds as they eat the berries as they're flying south. Wild strawberry makes a great ground cover and has excellent wildlife value. Violets, something else people tell me they hate. And I say, okay, pull them out of your vegetable garden, but plant them in your lawn. They make a really good ground cover. It's walkable, it's mowable, and it supports a lot of butterfly larvae. And lastly, this is the native impatiens, which is an annual and can be really, really, really tough. It's a self-seeder, but it's great for pollinators, and I've seen butterflies on them too. So you have to I missed the bluets. Does anyone have bluets in their lawn? Aren't they wonderful? There's a park in downtown Northampton where obviously they're not using a lot of chemicals. And it's crappy soil, it's compacted, but they get these huge sweeps of bluets in the spring. It's just really beautiful, much more beautiful than any chemically enhanced lawn could possibly be. Here are the 3 top keystone perennials. So these are the 3 top ones for supporting bees and butterflies. Goldenrods, they usually get a lot of groans on the goldenrods. But there are some species of goldenrods which are not aggressive. They're very well behaved and very beautiful. You probably have to seek them out at a native plant nursery. And then there's asters, and there's so many native asters. There's an aster for every growing situation: shade, sun, dry, wet, everything. And then lastly, native sunflowers, which There aren't quite as many of those, but they're really, really beautiful in the autumn landscape. This would be the genus Helenium. And I'm just going to show you some of my favorite garden plants that are really, really useful ecologically and have great garden value. So here are mountain mints, there's a few different species. These are two that I really like. Blazing Star, Liatris, there's maybe 4 or 5 species of these. The one that you see commonly is Liatris spicata, but there's other ones that are suited to drier conditions and wetter conditions. This is something that looks gorgeous in my garden. It's Pearly Everlasting, and it really can do very well in dry, poor soil. And these flower heads just stay on the plant. They kind of dry. You can't even tell they're dry. It just looks like the plant is still flowering in November. Bowman's root. Does anyone know Bowman's root? This is another one of my favorites. It's very delicate, makes a nice bushy mound, and I really like the way the little dried seed heads look in the winter. Ragwort makes a lovely ground cover in a wooded area, and I've seen this used in public gardens in Chanticleer in Pennsylvania. Have you seen that? There's just rivers of it running through their birch woods. It's really, really gorgeous, magical. And I've also seen it at some other places. It makes a really good ground cover. Penstemons are really easy to grow and very, very popular with bees. And again, there's different species that are good for different growing conditions. So now I want to talk about how you should be thinking about designing your yard. First of all, minimize the lawn, replace lawn wherever you can. And what you really want to do is create a situation where when the leaves fall out of the trees, they just stay exactly where they landed. No raking, no blowing, no chopping. This is not an entirely native garden. Obviously, this is a non-native magnolia. But here's an example. You see, this is all the leaves that just fell. This is something I stole from Margaret Roach's, if you read her column in the New York Times. Anyway, so you see, this is the drip line of the tree, the edge of where the outermost twig goes. And so all this is a garden. And all the leaves they just stayed there. Nobody did put any work into it and created this fabulous environment for insects to overwinter. Because up in a tree, in a native tree, there's all these insects they're living their lives, and come fall, they need to go somewhere for the winter. And so they cling to a leaf. Some of them actually stay up in the tree and cling to a twig, but most of them are clinging to a leaf. They fall to the ground, and either they want to stay on that leaf until the spring. They don't want to get chopped. They don't want to go to the dump. They just want to stay there. And some of them will leave the leaf and burrow into the soil underneath. So they need soft ground. And all this leaf mulch creates this soft, friable earth, that's what insects need. And if you're going to support insects, you have to give them everything they need through their entire life cycle. Somewhere to be an egg, somewhere to be a caterpillar, somewhere to be an adult, and then somewhere to overwinter. And this is where many, many caterpillars and a lot of bees are too. They're in the ground. So you could have a traditional perennial border you can do that with just native plants. But natives are really best suited to a more naturalistic style. Multiple layers are really important, as I mentioned, ground layer, shrubs, trees. The plants should be close together. You don't want, how there's a lot of garden styles where even a lot of the plant labels say like plant 18 inches apart. Well, that's not the way they're growing in a meadow. And a lot of times that's not the way they're growing in the woods. They're all close together. And if you plant them all close together, there's a lot of benefits to the plants. There's a lot of benefits to the foraging pollinators, because when they go from flower to flower, they just have a short hop. And a lot of them, especially the bees, focus in on one flower type and then they stick with it. They don't, if they start out on an echinacea, they just want to clean out all the echinaceas before they go on to a goldenrod. So if you have a huge sweep of close together plants, you're really helping them. You're saving them energy so they don't have to fly like 50 feet to get to the next meal. Also, you don't want to put down artificial mulch. When you first start a garden, yeah, you need mulch. But after that, you just want the dead plant material that's naturally occurring to be the mulch. And if you plant stuff close together, it will create its own mulch. And then because everything's close together, it's going to shade out any weeds that might want to germinate. So as I said, use leaves as mulch or sometimes natural wood chips, but don't bring in bark mulch or anything like that. And certainly not any landscape fabric. That's terrible. And you can make your naturalistic design look much more appealing to people if there's very sharp edges. And this is what the Xerces Society calls cues to care. So that you have hardscapes, mowing paths, mowing edges. Okay, next one, soft landings. The soft landing garden is kind of the ideal. That's where you have a native tree and underneath it you have a garden. And there's no need, you may want to edit out some things you don't like. You certainly are going to have to patrol for invasives, I can guarantee that. But the ground is very soft, takes very little maintenance. This is a very naturalistic design. This is a more formal design, but you can see you can make it work. And here is that nice clean edge. And also we see the clean edges of the tree trunks. And that contrast makes a naturalistic garden. And this goes back to cottage gardens and Gertrude Jekyll. This is Pete Udolph. All garden designers really use this contrast of the sharp edges and then the lush billowing plant areas. Even hill strips can be habitat. And this is, again, sort of depends on what the rules are in your town. But you can probably find something other than grass that will look pretty good in a hill strip and be able to tolerate those very harsh conditions. And in that pollinator pathway, Evan included one list of plants that you could put in a hill strip. So rethinking lawns, that's the main area of opportunity. So the greater you can reduce your lawn, then when the leaves do fall on that remaining lawn, you can just kind of gently shoo them into surrounding gardens. You don't need to chop them. You don't need to blow them. They don't need to go to the dump. I mean, if some of them do, that's fine. If the majority of your yard, it can accommodate just the leaves where they fall. So use grass as paths. If you can, interplant the remaining grass with bee-friendly things like clover, that prunella, thyme if it's very dry, even the flowering strawberries. There's, No Mow May was, a really good idea. It really got people's attention, and I think it really kind of broke the chokehold that a lot of neighborhoods had on the perfectly manicured lawn. A lot of people said, okay, I'm going to do No Mow May, and then they said, why am I mowing at all? Forget it, I'm not going to mow. The best thing, if you're going to have a lawn area, is to actually mow every 2 or 3 weeks. And there's been experiments that show that a higher lawn, one that accommodates little low-growing flowering plants, can support way more bees than a short lawn. And I have whole talks about what to do with lawns, but we'll move on. You can allow it to grow into a meadow, but even then it does need to be mown at least every 3 years because it'll just get taken over by woody plants. You could replace it with a genuinely native meadow, which would not have any European turf grasses in it at all, but that is a serious project. Adding trees and bushes, as I said, and never forgetting those cues to care so that your neighbors know that what you did was on purpose. It wasn't because you're just a lazy slacker who didn't want to mow your lawn, that you actually did it on purpose. I think I missed a slide. Okay. Yeah. So this is the great thing. This is so doable. Of all the environmental problems that we have, this is something within our control. And other simple things can make a really big difference. So I mentioned mowing. If you can have a little brush pile somewhere out of sight, that's huge. There's a new movement there's this very glamorous landscaper in the Hamptons called Edwina Gall, and she calls it zero carbon removal. That means anything that dies on your property stays on your property, doesn't go to the dump. And there's other good reasons to keep this stuff on your property. Deep piles of vegetation at the dump create a huge amount of methane, which is a terrible greenhouse gas. In fact, there was an article in the New York Times around Halloween about all the methane that everybody's Halloween pumpkins were creating, because everybody was sending them to the dump. But you could just, throw it in the backyard, and if it rots in an oxygen-rich environment, it won't create methane. If it's in a deep pile, no oxygen can get in, and you'll have anaerobic fermentation and methane. So leave messy areas, keep all your dead stuff. Snags, that's just a dead tree trunk. You can see there's a ton of stuff living in there. You can see the birds are going in, but there's whole ecosystems of beetles and other insects that only live in dead wood. Some of it just in standing dead wood, some of it in dead wood that's on the ground. Huge environmental benefit. 85 species of our common backyard songbirds are nest cavity nesters. They need a cavity to nest in. So, people are very afraid, that tree's gonna fall on my house or on my car. Well, yes, you have to evaluate that situation, but if it is not near your house or your driveway, and you think it might come down, you can just cut the branches off, and then it's much, much less likely. And it could stay there for decades, and then it will kind of just slowly disintegrate as things eat it and as it contributes to the environment. Providing a shallow water source, like just a saucer with a flat rock in it, can really help a lot of bees, especially during a drought. A lot of our bees are ground nesters. They need soft soil, so leaving some unmulched, unplanted, soft ground somewhere in your yard is very beneficial. Again, leave those leaves wherever they wanted to be. And cutting flower stalks. Ideally, never cut flower stalks, but especially the flower stalks that have 1/8 inch diameter or more. The bees that aren't overwintering or nesting in the ground are in those flower stalks. So if you can just leave them standing, you are helping many, many species of bees. And actually, they look really cool now. And it's a thing. Like if you look at all of the big name garden designers like Pete Udolph, he has said one of his criteria in choosing plants for his designs is how good they look when they're dead, because that's part of his design. So you could be doing that too. It is really important to encourage whatever children you have contact with, grandchildren, just encourage them to be interested and to appreciate bees instead of, so many kids are terrified of bees. I have people that come up to me and say, I could never have a pollinator garden because my son is terrified of bees. Well, who made him terrified of bees? Probably you did, because you're afraid of bees. Bees that are foraging, are feeding, they're not defending that flower. I mean, maybe if you grabbed it and made to squish it, it would bite you. But when they're flying around as like at the grocery store, they don't care anything about you. Yes, if you step on their nest, especially, well, yellow jackets are wasps, not bees. But, you know, for the most part, they're perfectly harmless. And you should teach children to be fascinated by them. You know, look how many there are. What are they doing? You know, can you figure out what kind they are? Not like, it's a bee. Another big thing that's really important is to minimize outside lighting. People don't realize how destructive their outdoor lights are. They can, many critters besides pollinators, but including birds, navigate by moonlight. And they're completely thrown off if you have like your outdoor garage light on. So if you just leave lights off, use downward facing lights and replace the bulbs with yellow LED bulbs or use motion activated bulbs, huge benefit to all of our wildlife. So here's some final thoughts. We are all stewards of the land. Protecting and restoring something it's so doable. And every plant, every small step makes a difference. Don't think, oh my God, I've got a half an acre of lawn. It's undoable. Just start with something small. Plant a tree, plant a little garden around that little tree. And then every year, you know, add to it, do something else. Don't let your idea of excellent be the enemy of good. Just anything you can do is great. So that is the end of my talk. We can take questions. And here's my contact information if anyone wants to email me. And there's information about the Massachusetts Pollinator Network on the table in the back. So do we have questions? Questions from the chat? You have a question?
I was wondering how you feel about compost.
Question is, how do I feel about compost? Compost is great. I mean, putting compost, you know, spreading it. Well, I will tell you a story about compost. When I was first learning about native plant gardening, I was part of a garden committee in the town I was living in, and we were putting in community vegetable plots. And we noticed that we were removing huge areas of milkweed. And we thought, well, this is bad. We have to do something to replace the milkweed with other pollinator-friendly plants. So we put in a pollinator garden. And this is before, I was just learning about this stuff. And the woman who was in charge of this said, well, we need to get a giant load of compost. And I said, well, you know, I've been reading that native plants really like lean soil. And she said, nope, we're going to do this right. And we got money from the town to buy $400 worth of compost. Some of it went on to the garden plots. But it was such a bear. We carted all this compost over to our native plant garden. And we planted all these native plants. And they grew huge. And then they flopped over. And the garden was a mess. And we realized they don't want rich soil. And that's one of the complaints about native plants. Oh, they're so floppy. Well, if you plant them in lean soil, they don't get that quick, weak growth. So save your compost for the vegetable garden. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Is this recorded?
Yes. You'll have to talk to Chris about where and when, but it has been recorded. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm surrounded by pine trees.
Uh-huh.
Pine needles don't exactly serve the same purpose as
Okay, so the question is, what about pine needles? Actually, pine needles do, if you have white pines, there are a lot of insects that live in white pines, not as many as oaks, but it is useful. And are not. There are some plants that can live in the shade of white pine. I mean, I think even pretty deep shade, if you can seek them out. There's some native rhododendrons. I think even some herbaceous plants, you could plant stuff under there. But it makes a lovely ground cover. I think it's beautiful. You know, people buy it in bales now. You can get it in pine needles, yeah.
Anybody wants it?
Okay, yes.
I was reading about, going back to the beginning of your talk,
Mhm.
with the neonicotinoids, that when the bees or the other insects collect the pollen from a plant treated by the neonicotinoids, they actually bring that pollen back to their
They do.
babies, and it
Yes.
kills all the
It
babies.
does, it can.
So I think
Yes.
that's something, to me, that's
Right.
so important.
Yes. So the statement is that when bees collect pollen from a plant that has been treated with neonicotinoids, bees use the pollen to feed their babies, either directly or they make these little kind of nutritious pellets that they pack in along with the eggs. And then when the young start eating that pollen, then either they die or there's something called sublethal effects where they can't grow as large, or they can't navigate, or they just can't successfully reproduce. So it's so pernicious. It's really scary. Neonics are very, very scary. They really need just to be completely outlawed. But unfortunately, we're a long way from that right now. But we can prevent it from coming into our yards. Yes.
I wanted to thank you for giving this talk today, and it's so timely because a report just came out that in the last 20 years, we've lost 22% of our native butterflies.
Right.
And I just wanted to give a shout out for another plant list. If you Google Dr. Jigir, G-E-G-E-A-R,
Right.
plant list for pollinators at risk, is a UMass professor. And we have a group that's been focused on his plants, and one of the butterflies of high risk is the American butterfly. American painted lady, not the painted lady, American lady, sorry, my brain's, anyhow. And he asked me if I had any pictures of them on the plants that he's recommending we use. And because we are ahead of the curve, I put a request out, and within an hour, I got like 10 people who have planted the plants and with pictures of the caterpillars. And so we know that his plant list works. It's not just the host plant, but the plants they use for nectaring. So I highly recommend that list. Native, what is it?
Right.
Plants for pollinators at
If
risk.
you just Google Jigir, that's Gegear at UMass Dartmouth, he's got a plant list. He has a plant list for at-risk bees and a plant list for at-risk butterflies, and they're both excellent. There's also a new, well, I just heard about it, I think it's relatively new, at the National Wildlife Federation. They have plant lists for those soft landing gardens, and they're listed in terms of, the most effective plants based on the number of bee and butterfly species they support, which is really, really useful. And that was done in conjunction with Doug Talman and his staff. Yes.
Another thing about Jagir's list that I find really helpful is you want to have things that are blooming at all seasons. And he says what plants are blooming at the different seasons that fit the insects at risk. And I found that I need shopping lists, so it's good.
Right, yeah, they're really good, and there's a lot of other information. It's actually a spreadsheet, and about each species, there's, plant color and height and bloom times, and it's really, really a good list.
I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on more deer-resistant plants. We planted a bunch of native stuff last year and it just got decimated. So
Yeah, that's a huge problem. It is a huge problem. So I have a few things to say on the subject of deer chomping your plants. One is, depending on the situation and the number of plants, I put fences around with hardware cloth, at least until they're big enough to make it on their own, because I not only have deer, I have bunnies too, and I think in my case, the bunnies eat more. I just listened to a talk by Larry Wiener. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a fabulous landscape architect. He wrote the book, Garden Revolution. He says, again, this is where planting things cheek by jowl. If you when he knows he's planting something that deer really like, in the same planting hole, he plants something that the deer cannot tolerate. And he says if they grow all intertwined, then the deer will leave the tasty one alone because they don't want to get a bite that has both of it. And a lot of the grasses and sedges are just, the deer just cannot eat those. So that's another strategy. You know about the woman who wrote the book called The Humane Gardener? What was her name? I'm not pulling it up right now. Anyway, she says, oh, just plant spiny stuff around the good stuff. But I think that might be really tough from a design point of view. Yeah.
The deer eat our roses with thorns, so, I can't get them big enough. You have to protect them, so
Right.
that doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, things that I have this book called something like native plants that deer won't eat, but different deer eat different stuff, and it depends on how hungry they are too.
Read that book.
You
Yeah.
don't read the books.
Yeah, they didn't.
I have a question from online.
Yeah.
I missed it if you said, what are the clues that would help me avoid buying plants treated with neonic?
You have to, okay, your choices are you go to a native plant nursery, and there are getting to be more and more of them. And also, there are a couple of the big nurseries in the eastern part of the state that now promise that they are not stocking anything with neonics. I believe Weston Nurseries is pretty reliable, and also Bigelow Nursery, at least for woody plants, because they grow a lot of their own, so they know. One of the big problems is in the horticultural industry, there's some, businesses that just plant seeds, and then they sell little tiny plants to another business that uppots them, and then another business that consolidates them, and then they get to your local garden center. And the garden center has no idea what happened to that plant before they actually bought it. So sometimes they just say, we don't know. And then you just have to say, sorry, I can't buy this plant. And then they get the message that they really need to keep an eye on their supply chain. So native plant nurseries, almost all the native plant nurseries either grow their own stuff from seeds, or their supply chain is very short and they're buying it from whoever planted the seed, so they know for sure. Another thing you can do is just plant your own plants from seed. And I do that. I volunteered at a native plant nursery. I still volunteer at Wing and a Prayer Nursery in Cummington. It'll be a long hike for you, but it's a great place. And this might be her last year, so you might want to get out there while you can. So, there's this thing called winter sowing. Has anyone read about that? It's a great thing. It really works. It's a lot less work than traditionally planting stuff under lights and keeping it watered. It's still, once you have the seedlings, you have to put them in, slightly larger containers, either like a 3-inch pot or 4-inch pot or these plug liners. But you can get a lot of plants very, very cheaply that way. So if you just Google winter sowing, there's a lot, there's Facebook page. Also, the Wild Seed Project in Maine has some great information on that. So those are, those are your options, yes.
For a while, there were people in the Massachusetts legislature who proposed a bill about getting rid of neonicotinoids.
Yeah.
And I haven't heard anything about that recently.
Well, as I've been working with the Massachusetts Pollinator Network and we've been doing a lot of political activism, I've learned that, boy, the legislature is where good bills go to die. It is just discouraging how long. When we used to be affiliated with the Northeast Organic Farmers Association, and they had this great guy who just did their policy work, and he said, if a bill was going to get into law, it would usually take a minimum of 7 years, and some group had to be putting it forward every year, and then it would die somewhere in committee, and then it has to go back to the beginning. And that's why this stuff is just so hard to change.
Some nurseries, like Weston Nurseries, some of the larger nurseries got involved in that. I wonder if that would help.
Weston Nursery has this, I think he's only been there a couple of years. Do you know him?
Yeah, I can't think of his name right now.
It'll come to me in a minute.
Trevor Smith.
Travis, yeah.
Trevor.
Trevor Smith, yes. And he is now in charge apparently of their plant propagation, or he has control. And he is all about, no chemicals in the plants. And he's a fantastic guy. He's just like a barrel of energy. I cannot believe all the stuff he's involved in and all the expertise that he has. But so that's one good reason to go to Weston, because he said he's convinced them to stop all these native plants, and he needs people to come in and buy them to show the nursery people that this is this is a good business plan. But you could I don't know if he would get involved. I've learned so much about our horticulture industry since I've been doing this. And I've realized that the basis upon which traditional garden centers make their money is just, it's just not compatible with ecological gardening, because they are so dependent on chemicals, and they're so dependent on cultivars and on the latest and greatest, crazy plant with, variegated foliage and red stems and double blooms, and they need to be able to sell the latest and greatest. And the plants, if you go to a native plant nursery, usually the plants are pretty, even ratty looking compared to the plants at a traditional nursery. There's someone I know who refers to the plants at a traditional nursery as pot poodles, because they're so, they're constantly fertilized and snipped, and, they're really, I don't know if in my talking to traditional nurseries, they are not ready to change. And one of their arguments is, our profit margins are so small now, we can't stop what we're doing, or we would just lose money. So I'm not sure they would be advocates, except for Trevor Smith. So, yeah.
But they also rely on distributors, and so like New England
Right.
Nurseries is a lovely nursery, but they don't know what's gonna come.
Right.
They have no say, they don't order what they want, it just comes.
Right.
And that's, but now they're starting to advertise native plants, but
And a lot of the ones they advertise are nativars.
I know,
Yeah, greenwash.
but they're beginning.
Right. And the more we go in and say what we want, the more of it they'll change.
I wanted to say that again, because everyone in this room has the power to make it change, because we started out, I was working with the owner, which they had native plants, bigelows.
Yeah.
Some straight species, but we kept asking for more and as long as we kept sending people there to buy them, that's the other thing, ask and then, support the nurseries that have them, Western nurseries.
Right.
Now, I wouldn't say all their plants are neonic free, so don't, the
Well,
native
ask, you
plants,
always need to ask.
the native plant section that Trevor's working on, but I wouldn't guarantee that the other ones are.
Right.
And, bigelows, they don't use, neonics and they don't get neonic treated plants that they finish off.
Mhm.
But for the shrubby plants or trees, you have to ask, because if they have an infestation of insects, they're not gonna lose a whole crop. So
Well, it
you
is
have
a
to
big
ask.
difference. I'm not advocating the use of any herbicides, but there is a big difference between, say, 7 and neonics. Neonics are just absolutely unacceptable in any form. There's others that I wouldn't say they're acceptable, but they're not nearly as damaging to the environment.
So when you ask, if they say they don't know,
Yeah.
say, okay,
Right.
I know one thing, I'm not shocking here, because
Yeah.
they can find out, and there's so many places more now that are going
Right.
neonic free.
Right.
Never shop at a big box store, even if it says they don't use them. Tags are.
Yeah.
Oh, because, just one other thing.
Yeah.
We talk about neonics, it's because they are a systemic pesticide that stays in the plant and in the soil for long life and continues killing after the initial spray. They're called a systemic pesticide. So you can ask a place, do you use neonics? And they'll say no, because they switched over to another systemic pesticide that we don't know the name for, the category. So ask for systemic
That's a
pesticides.
good point. Another thing about neonics and its relatives is that they're very water soluble.
Yeah.
So they wash through the soil. They don't just stay where you planted a plant. They wash downstream, they go into our water systems, and then they poison more stuff, the fish, the aquatic insects. Yeah, they're just really horrible. Yes.
What's your view on the small bug hotels, bug houses you can buy? Because
Yeah.
I read that they can be quite cheaply made and they can tear the wings as the insects trying to come in and out. So I don't know
Well,
if they're a good
but
idea.
the real, it's one of those things like no Monet that is very attractive to people and get people interested in, in the insects and providing for their needs. But in reality, a lot of the experts say they can also, unless they're cleaned out every year at the right time, they can harbor all kinds of diseases and actually poison, like infect the insects. So the best thing is to just leave those stalks standing. That's really the best way to, some of them are really cute and really beautiful. But yeah. Unfortunately, not a great idea.
What I do with my stocks, if there's an area that for some reason I really kind of want them cut back, I carefully cut them, in a spot maybe where there's not an area where they're gonna be living in. And then I put the stalks somewhere nearby, standing them up just like they were. And it makes me feel good at least.
No, I've heard a lot of entomologists say that that's good, that if you keep the stalks like intact, so if you're gonna cut them down, either cut them manually or use a weed whacker, don't mow them. And then just gather them up and put a bundle of them somewhere out of sight if you think they're too unsightly. And then there's another really great, I'm not sure she's technically a landscaper. Her name is Rebecca McMacken, and she is fabulous. I love her talks. And she was in charge of the Brooklyn Bridge Garden and did amazing things. And what she says is, because she had to make this garden in New York City look good for, the public. So she says to give your garden a mullet. Just if you have to cut stuff down, just cut stuff down in the front where people are walking by, and then just the back should just, be wild. So that's another strategy.
We have a recommendation from the chat as well. see from Sue, Lexington Living Landscapes was offering free native plant seeds for winter sowing. They also have a native plant sale that is opening up soon, as do the Middlesex Conservation District and Worcester County Conservation
That's
District.
true. I was gonna mention that these native plant sales can be really, really good.
And Native Plant Trust.
Right.
And they are offering native plant garden tours late in the spring. And also she would recommends avoiding Asian jumping worms when you buy or exchange plants.
If you can. That's another argument for growing your own plants.
It's a whole nother.
It's a whole other conversation. Yeah. But tell that person thank you.
I have one more thing to
Yes.
say, since we're all just talking about neonicotinoids,
Mhm.
you know, a good amount of your corn that's not organic, the seeds, if it's GMO corn, the seeds are treated with neonicotinoids. So anywhere you have GMO corn planted in your town, it's a lot of neonicotinoids getting in the soil and the groundwater.
Yeah,
Or moving
unfortunately,
through the groundwater.
corn is one of the most chemically intensive crops that we grow, maybe the most chemically intensive. Yeah, huge quantities of fertilizer too, which is just terrible, terrible for our groundwater. So,
May I make an announcement?
yes,
We're going to have a planting workshop in the Chancellor Library, May 15th.
May
And
15th.
we're planting some Dr. Jiguia seeds.
Yay, great. That would
So
be
you can
fun.
go to the library website and sign up.
Yeah.
If you're not for.
It's great. So that's one way to learn a lot. If you go to some of these group activities and volunteer, you know, there'll be people there who really know a lot and will answer their questions and teach you stuff, and you'll make new connections of people you can ask questions later. So I really recommend those activities if you can fit them in. That's how I learned a lot of stuff.
So we moved recently, we were in Pennsylvania before we moved to Massachusetts. And the house that we now live in has a prize exotic daylily collection. And they're beautiful, but I don't know what the best approach is, because I'm a big fan of native
Yeah.
planting. Would you incorporate or would you remove? I don't know if they're going to be a problem for the insects.
Oh, they're not, I don't think they're a problem. I certainly wouldn't plant anymore. You know, a situation like that is tough because a lot of the non-native plants really are beloved by people and they're beautiful. So I recommend just trying to beef up the rest of the yard with native plants. Plant some, trees and shrubs and try to just add as much native biomass as you can and just enjoy those lilies, without guilt, just enjoy them. And that's why that 70% is so important, because to tell people you cannot have a single non-native plant, just people are going to say, well, forget it, because I love my lilac and this was my grandmother's rose and I can't live without peonies, and that's fine. It doesn't have to be every plant in the ground. It just has to be the majority of plants. So that's what I recommend. So just enjoy them. Yes.
Butterfly bush,
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm clear on all the reasons.
Well, that's an interesting case because I think a lot of people got down on butterfly bush because for a long time there was this big rage of planting a quote unquote butterfly garden that just had nectar plants and didn't have any host plants. So, it was kind of like the poster child for, kind of useless ecological gardening. And, to my mind, if you're just going to look at it as a non-native plant, well, it's not any worse than, peonies or something, and it does provide nectar. The thing that is really a problem, and I'm not sure this is getting enough press, is that in a lot of areas, it is invasive.
It is amazing.
And it is moving, its invasiveness is moving north. It's not, I don't think it's on the list in Massachusetts right now, but it probably should be. And if it isn't, it probably will get to be a true invasive in a few years. It does self-seed very prolifically. And if you've been to the Pacific Northwest, it is just, it just, you can go for miles along roadways and it's just butterfly bush and miscanthus grass and nothing else. And that's, I think that's the fear. They've done a lot of research recently on invasive plants. And one of the things that they find is that a plant can enter the horticultural trade and be sold as a perfectly well-behaved ornamental for decades. And then all of a sudden, kaboom, it just takes over. And they don't know why this seems to be a pattern, but it looks like butterfly bush is on that path, becoming one of these plants that are just going to explode. And maybe it's because things are warming now, or maybe it's just genetically adapting to our environment. Nobody knows for sure. That's why it's kind of a plant of concern, should I say? Yeah.
I mean, there's different nutritional value to different, nectars or pollens. Are there some that are kind of like bee candy that,
Some
they're
people
they're
think
not as
that-
good as the
Well,
ones
I've
that-
read both sides of the story. There's actually a researcher at UMass who's looking at the medicinal qualities of sunflowers because she has evidence that bees actually go to certain flowers because of their medicinal qualities and that it helps them with, fight some kind of infections. So all nectar is not created equal. It's true. And there are some researchers who say that non-native nectar and berries do not have the same nutritional benefits as native plants. I've also heard people say, nectar is just sugar water. Nectar is nectar. But I don't think that's entirely true. I mean, maybe it is from the point of view of some insects, but not all insects. Yeah. I mean, if you really, really want to be safe, just plant native plants, and certainly don't make sure you have at least 70% native plants. Yeah.
Do you have opinions about the relative merits of different oaks, whether
Yes.
red or swamp white
Yes.
or scarlet or
Doug Tallamy wrote a whole book about it, the nature of oaks, and just, yeah. So yes, white oaks are the best in terms of supporting the largest number of caterpillar and insect species.
and among the whites? What do you think?
I'm not sure if there's one that's better, but it's the white oak that is the best. Yeah. He's very clear on that. He says if you plant one tree, let it be an oak.
A white oak.
Yeah, but it's going to be a giant tree and you have to have the right place for a giant tree. And if you don't, then
Then you could back off to something.
yeah, yeah. Something else that he talks a lot about. You see, I could go on and on, so probably someone should stop me. One of the things that he really recommends, instead of planting a single tree, is to plant a group of trees, like a copse of trees. And there's a lot of advantages to that. One is that they support each other as they grow, and they're less likely to be knocked down in a strong wind or a storm. And the other thing is that some really valuable trees really like to sucker and make a thicket. And if you're trying to just have like a single specimen tree, it will drive you crazy, all these suckers. But if you plant expecting to get suckers, then you'll be happy because you'll have this lovely thicket. And so one of the ones that doesn't get planted much in this country is the American plum. It's one of the cherries. It's in the prunus. And it has the most beautiful flowers that are so fragrant. I mean, it just hits you in the face with this beautiful scent. but it does like to sucker. And you might have a place where you could have like a big patch of these trees that just make, and so that could be a great thing instead of an oak. It doesn't have to be an oak. So you have to figure out what's going to work in your situation. Okay. Should we?
Well, one more.
One more.
I love hedgerows. And so
Yeah.
last year,
Yeah.
and a lot of people were like horrified because I have these plants too close together and they're growing into each other. And the birds and the insects and the other creatures, great tree frogs, et cetera, loved it. So, do you have ideas, recommendations about doing hedgerows?
Well, hedgerows are great. You're right. They are tremendous for all wildlife. In fact, the fact that many farmers are now cutting down their hedgerows is one of the reasons why we're seeing the decline of so many butterfly species, including monarchs, because they just want to use every square inch to plant, crops. But their hedgerows are really great because they do harbor a lot of insects and they can provide pollination services to crops. Yeah, there's just tons of things that look great in hedgerows. The one thing I have to warn you about is that edge habitat is where invasives are the most likely to be planted by birds, because birds love the hedgerows. So you're going to be on invasive patrol. Yeah. But they're great, and they can, it can be really useful. They can be a windbreak. They can be a privacy screen. Yeah. And they can have little oaks in them too.
I know.
Yeah.
I think somebody left a message, to,
Do we have another?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Sue says, she just found out forsythia is sterile. And while I love it, I am thinking I will remove it at least in some locations in my yard so as not to waste pollinator energy.
Yes. I personally think it's a problem plant because it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and takes over more and more real estate. And yes, birds live in it, but nothing else, they use it as shelter, but it doesn't feed anything. So yeah, it's gotta go. I agree with that. Okay.
Heidi, thank you so much. And there's some information by the door, and the recording of this will be on the Carlisle Environmental Sustainability Committee's website. I'm not sure exactly when, give it a couple of weeks. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Christina. Thank you for coming.